Last time we discussed the negotiations between the Ming and the Japanese, which resulted in the Japanese pulling away from Seoul. Now we continue on south to Busan and beyond. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. At the beginning of June, which was just around 20 days from when the Japanese had pulled back from Seoul, Li Rusong received a letter from his superior Song Yin-cheng, who is now headquartered in Pyongyang, with orders to stop stalling and pursue the Japanese. Now here's where things get messy. I have seen some evidence that this was actually Song Yin-cheng's way of stalling himself, while still appearing like he was supporting the Koreans' want to continue on with the war. Which is why it would actually take almost 3 weeks for his orders to actually reach Li. However, he was still commanding Li Rusong to continue the fighting. So, his intentions could really go either way. Either way, Li Rusong did in fact gather his men up and cross the Han and did pursue the Japanese. And while there was some skirmishes, they were incredibly small fights. Neither Li or the Japanese were all that interested in fighting, so Li called off the pursuit while the Japanese continued on south. The Japanese arrived on Korea's southern coast in the middle of June. Most of their supplies were gone, and they were slightly concerned about being attacked en masse. So they went to work on having 17 forts built around the beachhead at Busan. They also went to work on land so that they could actually grow crops to feed the men without needing supplies from Japan. In the beginning, in June, the 2 Ming generals that Li Rusong disguised as Imperial envoys, along with Shen Weijing, continued with them. Oh, I should point out that the 2 Imperial envoys' names were Ji Yongzhu and Zhu Yihuan. Shen would actually stay in the port at Busan to act as a negotiator should there be any problems, while Ji and Zhu would join Konishi Yukinaga and travel by ship to Hideyoshi's headquarters. They arrived on June 14th, and when they got there, all 3 of them rode through the streets on white horses with 150 men escorting them. Among these men were musicians that played instruments to let the civilians know that they were important. They then made it to where Hideyoshi was staying. On June 22nd, Konishi Yukinaga and several other daimyo officially received the Imperial envoys on Hideyoshi's behalf in the reception hall at Nagoya Castle. There was not an interpreter, so they actually had to communicate by writing and passing back and forth. The envoys didn't waste any time and demanded to know why were there still Japanese troops in Gyeongsang and Cholla province. The response that the Japanese gave was that the Koreans had actually prevented them from being able to withdraw completely. Ji and Zhu thought that this was a lie, but responded by saying that they would investigate and that currently the Japanese were breaking the agreement by having the men in these provinces, and that they must withdraw at once. The daimyo changed the subject completely, once again saying that China had to show its sincerity for peace and that the best way to do this was to accept Japan as a tributary state. If China was willing to do this, they would help them with their Jurchen problem. The envoys told them that this wasn't actually necessary, as the Jurchens had actually been a vassal for a decade now, which is honestly kind of funny if you think about it, how the Ming dynasty would fall to the Qing 50 years later. But that's a different subject. Talks eventually shifted into the Japanese claiming that, well, they had actually been trying to just get into negotiations with the Ming, but that the Koreans had tried to block them with their military. So the war was basically Korea's fault, and so they were justified in their actions. That's not true, but it was the excuse that they gave. But the Japanese did not end there. They continued by saying that should Korea continue to make these false claims, that they would have to continue on with Hideyoshi in command all the way to Liaodong and beyond to talk to the emperor personally. Now, I'm not really sure what these Ming envoys thought of this. Maybe they thought it was all a bluff. Maybe not. Either way, they took the note and said that they now fully believed what Kunishi Yukinaga had said to Shen Weijing about Hideyoshi's intentions for trade and so forth. And so there was really no need for Hideyoshi to make the journey to China. It doesn't seem that Hideyoshi ever really understood the real discussion that happened between his daimyo and the envoys, and was really relying on Kunishi and the others to tell him what was being said. Was he being told the full discussion? No. Instead, just like before, he was told things that he wanted to hear, such as it was China that was here to apologize for the recent aggressions and was ready to accept trade and relations on equal terms. And because he was happy with what he was being told, he made sure to have huge banquets held, and even tea ceremonies and no theater. Now, the intention of these banquets and the rest was to impress upon the envoys that they had a very powerful nation and that they had a sophisticated culture. It did not have that effect, though. Instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. And I'll give you an example why. During the events, the envoys were given seats that made them sit just slightly lower than the Japanese in attendance. Now, this was considered very rude by the Chinese. The envoys would have to endure this, though, and many other insults for a month. And while this was happening, the second siege of Jinju was already being prepared for. But we'll cover that next time. Now, before you go, do me a favor and stick around and consider supporting the channel by joining the Patreon account. I have several things planned, and your support can make those things happen. Please check out the pinned post down below. I'll see you next time.